Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Axel Johnson Foundation, I would like to convey our sincere gratitude for being here today and together with bokförlaget Stolpe, Stolpe Publishing Company, to launch Quinlan Terry's The Layman's Guide to Classical Architecture today. We Swedes come from a very small language group. We have men of small means and words, and therefore I immediately now, having said all the necessary things, pass the microphone to Marika Stolpe, the CEO and publisher of Stolpe Publishing. Please.
Thank you. So it's an honor and pleasure to be here and launch Quinlan Terry's book here at Downing College. And we're also very pleased that we could work with Clive Aslett, wherever you are, right here. And also very happy that you entrusted us to publish this book. So I'm now going to give the floor to Dr. Frank Salmon, Director of the Axel Johnson Center for the Study of Classical Architecture.
Well, thank you very much, Marika, and warm welcome to all of our guests. Thank you to the Axel Johnson Foundation for sponsoring this event, and also to the Master and Fellows of Downing College for agreeing to host it for us. So I will speak just for a few minutes, but I would like, if I may, to start with a personal story which is relevant to today's proceedings. And that it requires us to go back to 1989, those of us who can remember back that far. And to a period when I was a research student studying the history of classical architecture here at Downing College. And on a summer day, I met the master of the college with a tall, rather distinguished-looking gentleman. He introduced this gentleman to me as Quinlan Terry, who I think must have been at Downing at that time designing the Maitland Robinson Library, one of his 5 buildings on the site here. And the master said to Quinlan Terry, this is Frank Salmon, he's just been appointed to teach architectural history in the School of Architecture, University of Manchester. And Quinlan, you won't recall this of course, but you said, oh, that's no good. You're wasting your time. You're wasting your time, you said, unless you can get the students drawing the orders, the classical orders of architecture. Frankly, it was a rather dispiriting beginning to my career, and made no less dispiriting when I got to Manchester and found that Quinlan was really right. In fact, the classical orders were being drawn at Manchester at that time, as might be appropriate in a school of architecture that had a professor in the middle of the 20th century who had 4 times re-edited Normand's Nouveau Parallèle des Ordres. But they were being studied really by the students, I realized, so that the students could claim to have a veneer of knowledge of the classical language, in fact as a way of killing it off by feigning a deep knowledge when they didn't actually have that. And one of the first things I discovered teaching history in Manchester was that I was not allowed anywhere near the design studios because I might poison the students with historical ideas. So it was a rather dispiriting start. And what was being taught of the orders then was orthographical projection of the type that you see in Renaissance textbooks on the orders. Would that we'd had this book then, that as Quinlan says in the introduction, presents classical architecture not in a sort of technical way, but in a way the layman, and I would say also Quinlan actually, architectural students today, should see buildings in 3 dimensions, with the effects of light, as living embodiments of values both historical and continuing today. I think architects would benefit a lot from buying your book, not just Layman, if I may say so. Well, we should roll forwards, 33 years from 1989, and realise that we're now standing and sitting in one of Quinlan's 5 buildings that he added to Downing College, much to the generosity of the Howard Foundation, who I'm delighted to see are represented here today. And Downing College has become really now a site of historic importance in the history of architecture for 2 reasons. First, as one of the pioneering examples of Greek Revival architecture, the Enlightenment College, that's Downing. But secondly, as a locus classicus, if I may use the term, for the way that classicism developed in the later 20th century and into the 21st century. So it goes into the history books for 2 reasons now, not just one, and one of those reasons is very closely associated with Quinlan Terry. Well, Quinlan, I have a very clear recollection, as no doubt you have none at all, of that day in 1989, and where that conversation took place, which was right outside the Master's Lodge of Downing College, beside U Staircase. So little did I think, 30-odd years later, I would become the director of a classical architecture research centre, the office of which is in U1, right where we were standing when we had that conversation, 1989. It wasn't my choice. The college very generously made the room available, but that's serendipity for you, I think. So we will be teaching the classical orders to architecture students at our summer school this summer, and much more besides. We'll be teaching them also about the historical context in which classicism took place and what's made it a language that has had such a long history, an enduring legacy, but one that also promises for the future as well. So it'll be a summer school with a strong academic aspect to it, because the Centre for the Study of Classical Architecture is very generously funded by the Axon Johnson Foundation. Thank you very much indeed to our colleagues from Axon Johnson for that great gesture of support. We don't exist just to teach design, that's one of our processes, but also we're a research centre. We're bringing on younger people, PhD students, postdoctoral researchers, with a view to the next generation and to enriching our understanding of the classical language and its potentialities for the future. We're also running symposia and conferences like the one we'll be doing with brotherly institutions like the Karolinska Institute from Stockholm tomorrow, in fact, back here at Downing College. And we have a regular seminar series, which has, to our pleasure, already been attracting something of the order of 20 or so people in the room weekly during the Cambridge academic year. And that's no mean feat when there are seminars going on everywhere in Cambridge every moment of the day. We've also had about 50 people, up to 50 people watching online. Some of them, it must be said, getting up very early in the morning on the east coast of the United States to tune into our seminars, which happen at midday. So we have a rich program of scholarship and learning. We're going to teach a summer program, which is going to get lots of younger people drawing the orders, Quinlan, as you wanted, but thinking about buildings not in orthographical projection, but in 3 dimensions as living embodiments of values of societies. And I might just end, before I pass over to my colleague, with one final observation, which goes back to a dinner I was at a couple of weeks ago, where a second-year architecture student, undergraduate student, in our discussion over dinner, and I have to say, well before the wine had really started to flow as well, said to me, I don't really like any modern movement buildings, which is an extraordinary thing to hear from an architecture student. It would have been unthinkable 25 years ago that a young student could have said such a thing. Not, I think, because they couldn't be made to be interested in classical architecture if taught about it, but because the professors wouldn't let them. So that student was a student in the Department of Architecture, as I mentioned, and I'd like to introduce now, to follow on from my comments, the head of that department, my friend and colleague, Professor James Campbell.
Thank you very much, Frank. Well, I was a student in architecture school in 1987 when I first arrived. And as Frank's just sort of described, and it was well known, architecture school started where we were asked to design a building. I designed a thatched cottage on the River Cam because I like thatched cottages, and it was a reading space. And the first few little projects were about teaching you what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. And what quickly became clear was that thatched cottages and Ionic capitals were not acceptable, and concrete sort of things were. And but also, quite interestingly, it was very much a very narrow line of things that were allowed. So I had a friend who was a very big fan of Dennis Lasdun, but Dennis Lasdun wasn't allowed either. In other words, you had to toe a narrow line of what the tutors thought architecture was about. And the tutors, who are all architects, defined what they liked or didn't like by what they intended to design. And many years later, when I've been writing books and becoming much more an architectural historian than an architect, I think that one of the nice things is that you no longer have to worry about not liking something or liking something, and then people thinking you're going to design in that manner. Because as an architectural historian, people aren't worried whether you're going to design them something. And suddenly, as I tell my students, I'm allowed to enjoy the Rococo and other forbidden things. I actually do a lecture now to the first years, which is called The Forbidden Rococo, and how you can enjoy it. But what always struck me as rather daft was a legacy that came out of the early 20th century and has dominated architecture, was this idea, which David Watkin used to write about the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist is a historical idea. It's how you judge whether a particular period has a particular style. It comes out of those ideas. But the modernists thought that they could sort of create their place in history, that you had to reflect the period you in, and you had to prejudge what history was going to think your period was about, which of course is nonsense. The history is written by each generation, and each generation will look back in history and pick things that are relevant to them. I mean, Le Corbusier, when I was at school, at architecture school, you couldn't say anything bad about Le Corbusier. It was not allowed. But now, actually, most people don't like Le Corbusier very much, and they slag him off all the time. He didn't write, but his buildings have turned out not to be very environmentally conscious or sustainable. And it becomes clear that this morality and architecture, this idea that you have to be true to a spirit of the age, as David Watkin pointed out, it was something that Pugin sort of invented as an idea. But it doesn't actually make... There's nothing immoral about doing one style or a style of architecture is not in itself. I always say, an Ionic capital can't lie to you. I mean, it's not going to say anything to you at all. It's not an evil capital or it's not a good capital. It is just a capital. And what I could never understand when I was being taught architecture, and not to like thatched cottages, was why, if somebody wanted you to design them a thatched cottage, you shouldn't be allowed to design them a thatched cottage. If somebody wanted to have classical architecture, what was really wrong? Were we not, as architects, really, at the end of the day, just glorified bespoke tailors? And when I then went into practice, I designed modernist skyscrapers in Hong Kong. And then I came back and I did a PhD in architectural history. And so then I became a conservation architect. And one of the first things I had to do was do an interior in Draper's Hall. And I thought, well, what I really want to do here is not what the 1970s architects had done, which is produce something that really stood out. I wanted my intervention to look so utterly seamless that you couldn't tell it had been an intervention. I went back last year, which is about 10 years after I did it, and I couldn't tell what I'd done, so either they've ripped it out or I must have been successful. But in that process, one of the things I was doing was I was doing a classical museum interior. And of course, my architectural training had ill-prepared me to do this. I was very interested in architectural history, and I'd spent a lot of time looking at buildings. But now I had to set out a set of orders and produce a set of arches and a proper cornice and skirtings. And of course, nobody had ever taught me to do that. I had to teach myself. What I really could have done with is a book like this. And of course, and going through that process, exactly what I should have done when I was at architecture school, which is to understand classical architecture, as you sit down and you realize that suddenly you have to make this archway 3 inches wider, then everything moves. The whole thing has to move across the whole facade, because an arch, of course, then knocks on, is 3 inches wider, its diameter gets taller, and everything has to shift. And that is the art of designing. The art of designing classically is to just hide that actual difficulty. But it is difficult, and if you don't understand how it works, you can't understand how to do it. You can't also really appreciate the subtleties of it. The other thing is, a long time after I qualified as an architect, I visited lots of Le Corbusier buildings. I always think it's a good idea to go and visit things that you don't think you like and just check whether you really don't like them. But I also thought, well, everybody's been very rude about Poundbury, so I'll go and find out. Because I think it's really important, as I say, to go and see. And I liked Poundbury. I couldn't really understand why architects were so rude about Poundbury. It seemed a very nice place to live. And it seemed a very gentle place. And one of my favourite walks along the river is to Richmond. Whereas you'll know, as it says in this book, many guides say there's this large set of classical buildings which were built in the Victorian and Georgian era and lovingly restored by Quinlan Terry. And watching the people sitting outside them in the sunshine and enjoying themselves. It's a brilliant piece of urban design. The way the terraces come down and it meets, and it fits so beautifully in its setting and what it's facing. And one of the things that modernism never managed to do is it never managed to deal with the urban. If your building has to look different from everything around it, it can't sit into a townscape. It can't form a town or a village this way. It's always got to be an object that's shouting, look, I'm different from everything else. And I think that Richmond, even though everything in that thing is built at the same time, has that rich diversity that looks like it was brought up at different periods and over time. So I would hope that young architects growing up today could learn about how to do classical architecture properly. And we could also do with one for Gothic architecture as well while you're about it, and maybe thatched cottages. But I think this is really important, that the rhetoric that was going on in the 1980s was, very harsh, but it was also ridiculous. I never heard a good philosophical argument as to why you weren't allowed, if you were a client, to have the building you wanted to have. And so I would like to thank you, Quinlan, for writing this book. There was a young man in the year below me who was called Francis Terry, who had to design, who defiantly designed very beautiful classical buildings throughout his 3 years. And he had a very hard time, and I would hope nobody in my school of architecture would be given a very hard time for reading this book and producing designs according to it. Can I hand you over to Clive Aslett and the hero of the day, Quinlan Terry.
Let me get you a glass of water. Thanks. There. You can sit down. Yes. Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have been involved with this book published by Stolpe to such a high standard, and also to have been editing it for Quinlan Terry. I wrote a book about Quinlan Terry in 1986, which he was just observing was nearly 40 years ago. So the association is a long one. And a little while ago, he sent me a photograph that he'd taken whilst we were doing this, and it shows Quinn, looking exactly as he does now, wearing a Panama hat, in the garden of his house at Higham, and me, not quite the same, but I'm not wearing a hat. But we're both sitting in deck chairs. It's a sunny day, and we're both drinking a glass of champagne and laughing. And that's a very happy memory, but it wasn't all glasses of champagne and laughing. I thought it was too frivolous to put that image on the screen today, because when I think back to those days, the 1980s was still a pioneering time for classical architecture, and who would have thought that there would have been then a centre for the study of classical architecture at Cambridge, or such a civilised head of architecture as James here. So it's been a joy for me to do this, and I'm delighted now to have a conversation with Quinn about this book. It's a book which, as you'll discover when you look at it downstairs, is illustrated principally by drawings and principally by drawings by Quinn. And we'll talk about those in a moment. But I wanted to start by asking some slightly more general questions. And I wondered, Quinn, what you would say if somebody put it to you, what is the purpose of classical architecture in the age that we're living in, the 21st century?
Well, I think its purpose really is to do what classical architects have always done, which is to look at the world around them, observe the buildings that they like, and continue in that tradition rather than try and do something which has never been seen before.
And it's the tradition of construction as well as ornament?
Well, I think one of the great things that's been forgotten by the modernists is that, I mean, come on to this later, but really the person who ought to be thinking about more than me is Raymond Earth, because I dedicated the book to his memory, because he was really the person who taught me not only about the classical orders, but about how to build. It's one thing to be academic and be able to draw Doric, Ionic and Corinthian orders correctly, but it's quite another thing to put up a building which doesn't leak, which the client's happy with, which lasts for as long as other classical buildings, which is hundreds of years. And he taught me that. And of course he believed it all. Can you hear me? Can you? Can you hear me? I think there's something here. I think I've got something here. That better? Can you hear me now?
Is that better?
No, I just think that you know, Raymond Earth, apart from people who knew well, he was virtually unknown, but he understood everything about classical architecture. He taught me not only how to put the building, the order together, but also how to build and how to give the information to the builder on site, and how to build proper lime mortar and stonework and everything that goes with it. And that's really, I think, the key. And I was with him for 11 years before he died. And it's all right to go to a school, but better still is to work alongside a great man who's doing it. And that really is how I learnt how to do it properly.
And I think that you're right, that modern buildings have a life of 30 or 40 years. Well, buildings like the Howard building that we're in are going to last for a very, very much longer time.
Well, I mean, it seems to me terribly relevant today when we're so worried about sustainability, because traditional buildings are built in bricks in lime mortar, a slate roof, timber trusses, normal construction, and they last for hundreds of years. And you can go all around, not just Downing, but Cambridge, to see examples. And that goes through the Gothic and the Renaissance, and throughout that long period, you've got buildings that last for hundreds of years, and even 1,000 years. I mean, the Pantheon is 2,000 years old, and it's still in regular use. Whereas if you use all the modern materials, and particularly cement, and cement in brick mortar means that you have to have expansion joints, and expansion joints are a weakness because they allow the building to leak. And also skyscrapers made of glass and steel and concrete have a life of a few decades. Usually they say, in fact, they actually announce that, you know, this building has a useful life of 40 years. So if you're going to rebuild all these huge cities that are going up every 40 years, just think of what it's going to do to the environment. So quite apart from everything else, it makes sense.
Here is a building by Earth, a building of timber construction.
Yes, this was actually being built when I was in my last year at the AAA, and there were tremendous objections in Hampstead to building it, but three of us, Andrew Anderson, who probably many of you have heard about, but he was the bright boy of the three of us, and one other, Malcolm Higgs, the three of us wrote and said that we, this was just after we qualified, as recently qualified architects, actually like this building and we think it ought to go up. And we got a letter from the president of the RIBA saying, you say you're recently qualified architects, but you're not yet qualified because you haven't actually done your professional practice exam or something of that sort. But the interesting thing about that building, which Raymond Earth built, is it's got a timber frame. It isn't a stone. It isn't a stone or brick building. It's not a masonry construction, but it's actually timber. And he was inspired by a pub he knew in North Essex, which also had a timber frame, and he couldn't see why he didn't do it. And it's made of 12 by 12 timbers, and the ones on the roof are 12 by 15 inches. Huge construction. And the engineer who was doing it with him, who calculated it, managed to, when we got building regulations approval, which you have to do all these things, he managed to persuade them that it was acceptable. And what he said was that in the war, he was involved in firefighting for a lot of the warehouses in the Port of London, which also had a timber frame. And if you fought a fire which was a timber frame, the fire usually singed the outside of the timber, but didn't go right through to the center of the structure, and you could fight the fire for much longer. Whereas if it was a steel frame, it only got, once it got to the melting point of the steel, it collapsed. So they found that, in fact, it was a better form of construction, even in those days.
What was it like being, for Raymond Earth, being a classical architect in the 60s, and indeed for you starting your career in the 70s?
Well, Raymond Earth was a very independently minded person. He just knew that classical architecture was the thing to do. He fortunately had a private income, so he managed to be able to do it even if he hadn't got any clients. And he actually built a lot of good buildings. He did number 10 Downing Street. He did college in Oxford as well.
But it was a hard road to hoe.
It was a very hard road, and I think he was encouraged by my being there. But we got on very well, and he taught me really virtually everything I knew until he died in 60. When was it he died? Mike, you know when he died? When?
73.
73, that's right, yeah, 73.
Well, could you tell us a bit about the Layman's Guide? Why did you write it?
Well, I think partly because I said things I learnt from Raymond Earth I thought needed to be recorded. But I also felt that if the layman can begin to understand what he's looking at, then he'll be able to commission architects who would like to do things like that. I mean, it's rather like, I think I put it in the first chapter about if you're interested in wildflowers, you have to read a book about wildflowers, and immediately you've got words like petal and sepal and stamen and anther and filament, and you don't know what they are. And unless you're really keen, you just look at the flower and you think it's pretty. But if you're a little bit more interested in botany, you will look at the diagrams and see what he's talking about, and the fact that there's a family of buttercup family is different from the rose family, and you begin to understand what you're looking at. And when you understand, then you can talk to someone more intelligently. And if the layman can understand what is an architrave and a frieze and a cornice and a modillion and a whole lot of other things, then they can begin to talk about architecture to their client, or say to their useless architect, why isn't there an entablature? Because quite a long time architects don't know what an entablature is. They think it's something up there with a bit of a point on it. But it does need quite a lot of work to understand. And I thought it's important to get the names so people who are really interested would learn them and begin to grasp what it's all about. I mean, this actually, I've got another diagram showing the actual name, but that is the cornice of the Pantheon. And Earth persuaded me, encouraged me to be a Rome scholar for 6 months in Rome, and I spent, it was very valuable. Actually, what was valuable was knowing what to look at, because he told me what to look at. So I didn't just go to Rome, I actually was told what to see and why. And I was, at the British School, they were very good. The building was scaffolded at the time, so I managed to get permission to climb the scaffolding and measure the actual Pantheon. You can see how enormous it is. And once you see these buildings and you realize that the Romans were doing this in the 1st century, you realize what an incredible building it was, you know, so big and lasting so long, and with all the correct mouldings. And those, you can see the row of egg and tongues, they're all 6 inches high, about the size of a head, and then the medallions atop, above them. And once you begin to see it, it's not, you know, you don't have to be doing it for long before you realize how fascinating classical architecture can be.
And you went on the scholarship because there wasn't much going on in the office, is that right?
There wasn't, no. It was very little to do. And he said, well, look, you could take 6 months off and learn something in Rome.
And the Pantheon wasn't the only drawing that you measured.
No.
It was the Chiocciola staircase in the Vatican by Bramante. And your measurement, in fact, it discovered something which probably nobody's known since Bramante.
Well, this actually, it's very under-visited. I mean, I think I got permission. Again, it's helpful being at the British School because they've got contacts. But I managed to get into this Chiocciola staircase, which is in the Vatican. And as you probably, I don't know whether you can see, but it is actually 8 columns, and it's a spiral ramp for taking loads up to the top of the building. And it has a Tuscan and a Doric and an Ionic and then a composite order. So you've got these orders going around. So you get 8 Doric columns and then 8 Ionic columns. And each of them was measured in Letterile. Letterile is the great book on classical architecture, which the French produced. It's a fantastic work. And so I measured all these. I measured each of the orders. And then as I walked up, I noticed that when the Doric changed to Ionic, it seemed to be a very easy transition. And I thought, how does it do it? And then I realized that Bramante, being such a brilliant architect that he was, he made, in each revolution, he made each column slightly thinner than the one before, so that when you'd done a revolution, the top diameter was the same as the bottom diameter of the order above. So in fact, it wasn't just 4 different, it was actually 48 different, because each one was a different size. And to do that, well, not only do you have to know how to do it, but you need a mason who knows how to carve and make these very minor adjustments to each column so it's slightly less.
And you have to have a pretty sharp eye to spot what he's done, I dare say.
Well, I had the whole day to look at it.
Well, there are lots of different types of drawing. Tell me about this one of St. Mark's.
Well, I don't know quite why I did that, but what interests me is that classical architecture isn't just Doric, Ionic and Corinthian order, but it's much bigger than that. And it goes right on through the Gothic period and the Romanesque, and it's spread to all countries. And when you analyze a Gothic building, you see that in fact it has the same elements. It has a column, and the column has a base, and the base isn't exactly like a classical base, and it has a capital, and the capital usually has some leaves on it. And on top of that, it's got a beam or might have an arch. So in fact, it's using the same ingredients as classical architecture, but in a very different way. And I think it just shows that classical architecture is, I would include, and that's why I've included it in this book, it includes medieval work and Gothic work. And, you know, at different periods in the history of the world, architects and builders particularly, have looked at a structure and realized that it needs a column and it needs an arch. And although they're aware that there's a way the Romans did it, there's ways that they might do it slightly differently. And so you get that terrific variety in its detail.
Yeah. Of course, they didn't know they were being Gothic.
No,
Didn't exist at the
No, I
time.
mean, in the 19th century, sadly, the Pugin came along and he was very clever and he was brilliant at doing the Houses of Parliament, but he had this conviction that Gothic was Christian and Classic was pagan, which is a bit absurd because there's not a Gothic. I've spent a lot of time in Rome. I don't think I know a single Gothic church in Rome. All the churches are classical, so, but Pugin, there were these sort of ideas flying around in the 19th century, but I don't think it matters really because people just carried on doing the architecture
We
they
talk
wanted.
about Indian architecture and, for example, Petra,
Yes,
where the architecture of the Treasury building is carved out of the living rock.
yes, yes.
Tell me about Sir Giorgio. This is an example of Palladio being Baroque.
Well, I think the thing about Palladio is that he knew the Pantheon really well, and he knew the Corinthian order, which the Pantheon has, and also when he did, this is San Giorgio in Venice, everything he learnt from Rome, because his sketchbooks there, engravings, 99 engravings of important buildings in Rome. I mean, Palladio was a genius and incredibly busy, and he designed these churches in Venice, and this particular one. I mean, people talk about a building being Baroque, and Palladio was not known as Baroque, he was just thought of Renaissance. But actually, on this big building, on the front, there's no less than 4 versions of the Corinthian order of different sizes. I mean, that's the composite order. I mean, he used composite and Corinthian indistinguishably, which I think was right, because really there's only 3 orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And Tuscan is a simpler form of Doric, and composite is a more complicated version of Corinthian, which is this one here. But we say that, we don't think of Palladio as a Baroque architect, but actually to have 3 different styles of Corinthian on one facade, and if you go inside the building, if ever when you next go to Venice, just count the numbers of different uses of the Corinthian order, you'll find there's 7 internally. So it's one of those things you discover if you're going to Venice with a sketchbook.
Yeah, I mean, the importance of sketching. This is one of the things you talk about in the book, isn't it?
Yes.
It's very helpful for the analysis, even if you're not an architect, the analysis of architecture to closely observe in drawing.
Well, we used to do sketching parties. We had about 25 friends went to Rome and to Venice to have sketching parties, and I think there was one other who was what we might call a serious sketcher, but everyone else just had sketchbooks. I said, if you come to this, we went for a week and stayed in the Grand Canal, and we would in the morning go and sketch. And it's extraordinary how people who know very little about architecture, if they sit with a sketchbook and look at something like that for half an hour, and then they begin to hold out their pad and see that it would actually fit in what they've drawn. And then they hold out their hand, and if anybody, I mean that, really anybody, everybody in this room, could actually sketch like that if they applied themselves just sitting and no hurry, and you could spend hours doing it, but it is this process of looking at the detail and then looking down and drawing it. And as you look up and look down, I always think it's better to look up for about 10 seconds and down for 1 second, because we tend to look down and draw, but actually want to look up and then see what you're drawing, and then draw a little bit. And in that way, that's really the way you understand what classical architecture is all about.
This is not only a beautiful drawing, but it's such an interesting one, because you have explained the names of all the different parts of architecture, and it's so fascinating that some of them have very rather homely origins, and certainly they evoke a civilization which was living very close to nature.
Yes, well, I mean, the Romans, I mean, well, the Greeks before, I mean, I've got put the Greek and the English word, but you look at the column capital, and then on the top of the column capital there's that circular moulding, which is called an echinus, which those of you who know your Greek means hedgehog. So you've got a hedgehog, and underneath that is that abacus. An abax is a slab. So you've got a post, which is the shaft of the column. You've then got the hedgehog around it, and then you've got the slab, which supports the architrave. And the architrave, arche, great, trabs, Latin, beam, master beam. So you've got architrave, and then above that is the frieze. And the frieze in a Doric has a metope and a triglyph, do you see? And that, well, you can see them out of the window over there. You can see triglyphs and metopes. The metope is usually square, that's between holes, and the triglyph from trigluphos, thrice grooved. And then on top of that is the cornice, Greek koronis, coping stone, and it's the various parts that go into the thing. So it's all based on really tradition and common sense.
And I think you describe how the cyma, reverso and recto, are put together in the ovolo in actually quite simple ways to make these rich mouldings.
Yes, actually mouldings, people get fussed up about mouldings, but actually it's terribly simple because we haven't got the diagram, but you can see the echinus isn't what we call an ovolo moulding, egg, so that's circular. If it's the opposite, it's a cavetto, and you've got examples of that. So you've got ovolo and cavetto, and if you have the ovolo and then the cavetto, that's a wave in Greek, which is a cyma. And then you can have two sorts of cyma. You can have a cyma which is undercut at the top or undercut at the bottom. So you have cyma reversa, cyma recta, cyma reversa. And you can see all, I mean, this is really why when you look at, for instance, here, you can see medallions and coffers. And the thing about coffers is that you always have a square coffer between a medallion. And if you're used to looking at architectural detail, you will really begin to appreciate and enjoy the detail of all classical buildings. I mean, this one is quite a good example because at the top you've got the cyma recta at the top, then you've got a little cyma reversa underneath, then on top of that you've got the corona, and with the coffers and medallions going around, and then below that you've got an ovolo and a cavetto.
It's explained in the book, if you didn't get it all at first go. But it's really fascinating. Oh, Quinn, you must tell us about the art of lino cutting.
Well, I did lino cuts at school, and I did a lot of lino cuts with Andrew Anderson at the AAA. This is actually, I've encouraged Eric in the office, who's here, to do lino cuts, and he has done this lino cut, which is quite useful because it shows you're looking up at all the bits that I've just been talking about. You can see the dental course, you can see the underneath of the corona, and you can see the triglyphs, and below the triglyph are those little teeth. They're called gutti. And between the two triglyphs is the metope, which has that circular thing in it. Once you've got used to these ideas and seen it, it makes you enjoy looking at buildings at all times, and I'd encourage you to do so. And really, this is really the purpose of the book, that people might, by studying it, begin to enjoy what otherwise just seems incomprehensible.
And we illustrate your buildings to show how these parts are put together on a facade such as this at Library Court.
Well, when you've mastered the Doric order, which is the lower one, you can see you've got triglyphs and metope, you've got the column, which will be 8 diameters high, you've got the entablature, which is the architrave, frieze and cornice, which is usually 2 diameters, because everything's based on the bottom diameter, usually. But then, when it gets more interesting, you can then have a superimposed order, so you put an Ionic order on top of a Doric order. And that really means, because the column has entasis, which means it goes in as it I'm afraid to say these pilasters along here don't have entasis, but columns normally have entasis, particularly circular ones. And then you have, so the top diameter of the Doric order is the same as the bottom diameter of the Ionic order, so it's like a tree getting thinner and thinner as it goes up. And the Ionic order is usually 9 diameters high, and it has slightly different proportions, but again, the same parts. And rather than having triglyphs and metopes, it has medallions, which you can see there in the cornice, and then a segmental pediment, which goes over the top.
Going to move on. This building, of course, no prizes for guessing what it is. This is the building that we're in, and as James said, how wonderful it is that John Howard of the family, who very generously paid for this building, and indeed the whole
Courtyard, yeah.
Is here with us today. Quinn, would you like to analyse this facade?
Well, the first thing to say is it's broken one rule, but no one seems to notice, is that it's both composite and Corinthian. I hadn't done a composite order before, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to have the Corinthian and the composite. So the columns at the centre are composite, which means it's more of a mixture of the Ionic with the Corinthian, and then the ordinary Corinthian for the pilasters either side. The pilasters, being flat, have flutes. The columns, being circular on this occasion, don't have flutes. And then in the middle, there's a sort of Doric order with a broken pediment, and joint and segmental, based on various buildings I'd measured in Rome. And actually, what's quite interesting about these buildings here is that we have the Tuscan, the composite and the Corinthian on the front. You can see it as you go. We have the Ionic, well, you've got it here in this room, and if you look out of the window, you see the Doric order over there, and the residential building, which is Tuscan. So in fact, you get all 5 orders,
in this
around this.
In this one group. Where did the idea of the rustication in the end bays come from?
Well, I think I was beginning to dabble with the Baroque. Raymond always encouraged me to dabble with Baroque because I think he thought I was more Baroque than him. He was more sort of early Georgian. And there are examples where Michelangelo and architects like that have done the Baroque. And the interesting thing about classical architecture is that all the sort of human feelings find their way into architecture. I mean, Michelangelo was a difficult, angry person, very different in character to the architects like Bramante, for instance. And Bramante knew all the rules and did them very well, and he was, right at the beginning of the Renaissance. Michelangelo came along 100 years later, and he knew all the rules, and he liked to break the rules, which he did. And you either like Michelangelo or you don't, but he was very skilled at breaking the rules. And things like rusticating corners was part and parcel of what he did.
Breaking the rules.
Yes.
Ionic applied to one of your buildings in Baker Street, I think.
Yes, well, there's nothing really to say particularly about, I mean, just an ordinary Palladian Ionic order. But the only thing is, to bear in mind that, and really it's for people who would like to know more about classical architecture, this is the thing you want to look at. That when you look at the medallions, as those are called, those little blocks in the cornice above the Ionic capital, you've got the entablature, that's the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. And in the cornice you have the medallions, and you can see there's 3 medallions, and then it breaks. A break is when it turns and returns along horizontally again. And between the medallions is a coffer, which is like the ones we're looking at here. And the skill is that you must always have square coffers. And so when it breaks forward, it's got to be a square and then another square and another square between the medallions. And I think that if a client knows that and talks to his architect about it, you've really got a good, a good relationship and understanding, which I think is why we do it. I mean, why do we take all this trouble and lay people don't understand it?
And this is our last slide, and this is Richmond Riverside, which James talked about so well, because it's wonderful to visit. One thing that people tend to think that it was built in the early 19th century or the 17th century, the 18th century, and the Regency, whereas actually it was all designed by Quinlan in the mid-1980s. And as you can see, it's enormously popular because the lawn in front of it is always thronged by people enjoying a lunch break or enjoying a drink after work. And it has a very, very happy atmosphere. And it's a marvellous example, I think, of a major intervention in a city. I mean, an example of town planning. But how happy town planning can be when it's done in this way. And as the world population increases, we need more and more cities, and as cities, unfortunately, tragically, get destroyed, they need to be rebuilt. And examples like this perhaps give a clue as to how they might be made better. It reminds me of Poundbury, and it reminds me also that the Prince of Wales wrote the foreword to this book. He's been very important, hasn't he, Gwen?
I think that we should be very grateful that the Prince of Wales has been such a stalwart support for classical architecture. He hasn't been thanked by the RIBA. The RIBA always complain, if I were the Prince of Wales, I'd say stop calling it the RIBA and just be the Institute of British Architects, because they haven't woken up. I mean, I think it's great that we've got this, opportunity to have classical architecture really sort of in the middle of Cambridge to remind people of it. But I think the sad fact of the matter is that, it's a bit like the Church of England. There are great churches up and down the country, but the RIBA, the bishops don't seem to be aware of it. Similarly, with architecture, you've got quite a lot of classical architects now practicing. I mean, not by any means the only one. Whereas, Raymond Earth was the only one. There are now more and more classical architects, and some of their work is extremely good, and we'll see examples of their other work, which is a very recent happening. But the RIBA is not interested at all. If you read the magazine, it's all about modern architecture and showing pictures of the most hideous buildings.
That's a good moment to stop.
Yes.
Tea away. Quinn, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for the book. Can I just say a huge thank you to the Axon Johnson Foundation for so generously sponsoring the Centre for the Study of Classical Architecture. Thank you to Stolpe for making this marvellous book. You can buy it if you go downstairs at the bargain price of £20. And can I also say, Marika, I think you have something to mark the occasion with.
Yes, I'd like to give you this, Quinlan.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you so much.
Not sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Okay. Right.